On a Monday night in Washington, D.C., the Indiana Fever built a 17-point lead, watched it nearly vanish, and somehow walked out of Care First Arena with a win that will be replayed for years. Caitlin Clark caught a cross-court pass, stepped into a three-pointer from just in front of the logo, and buried it with 1.2 seconds left, giving Indiana a 78-76 victory over the Washington Mystics. Roundtable Sports. It was her first true buzzer-beating game winner in the WNBA, and it came at the end of one of the strangest, most chaotic final minutes the league has produced this season. But the box score only tells part of the story. The shot that decided the game wasn't the shot Indiana had drawn up. It was the byproduct of a broken play, a missed steal attempt, and a connection between two teammates that has been building for 2 years. To understand why that distinction matters so much to Fever fans, you have to rewind through the entire game, and through a season that had already been testing the patience of a fan base that built its identity around watching one specific player operate at the absolute peak of her sport. A 17-point lead, and then a slow bleed. Indiana looked dominant early. The Fever took a commanding 43-29 lead into halftime. Indianapolis Recorder, riding a first half that featured Clark at her most explosive, including a 4-point play that had the building buzzing before the third quarter even started. For a team that came in with question marks about consistency, it looked like the kind of laugher that ends with bench players getting fourth-quarter minutes. Washington didn't let that happen. The Mystics outscored Indiana 24-17 in the third quarter, cutting the deficit and turning a blowout into a one-possession fight heading into the fourth. Roundtable Sports. Whatever comfort the Fever had built in the first half evaporated possession by possession. By the time the fourth quarter opened, this was no longer a game Indiana could afford to play loosely. The closing stretch turned into a genuine roller coaster. Aaliyah Boston came up with a massive steal with 11.3 seconds left, leading to a fast break layup from Kelsey Mitchell that put Indiana ahead 75-74. Indianapolis Recorder. It looked, for a moment, like Indiana had weathered the storm. Then the game flipped again. A shooting foul sent Washington's Sonia Citron to the free throw line, and she made both shots, putting the Mystics back on top 76-75 with just 4.3 seconds remaining. Indianapolis Recorder. That left Indiana with one possession, less than 5 seconds, and a deficit to erase. The timeout, the design, and what actually happened. Stephanie White called timeout to set the final play. What the coaching staff drew up in that huddle has become the most discussed 30 seconds of Indiana's season, not because of what was intended, but because of how completely it unraveled in real time. According to the inbounding sequence reconstructed after the game, Clark started the possession on the baseline, set a decoy screen for Lexi Hull, then ran off a second screen from Aaliyah Boston on the far wing. Hardwood heroics. In other words, Clark wasn't the first option. She wasn't even the second. The design used her gravity, the attention every defender pays her, to try to spring a different teammate loose. It's a standard basketball wrinkle. Use your most dangerous player as a decoy, and if the defense overcommits to taking her away, somebody else gets a cleaner look. Washington's defense didn't take the bait the way Indiana hoped. Instead, rookie guard Cody McMahon, who'd been assigned to Clark at the start of the inbounds, peeled off to gamble on the passing lane. When McMahon's attempt to jump the lane failed, Clark suddenly had the entire floor to herself. Hardwood heroics. Sophie Cunningham, who delivered the inbound pass, found her instantly. Cunningham threw a cross-court pass toward Clark just as the Mystics defender lunged for the steal and missed it completely. Just women's sports. What followed has already become a piece of WNBA highlight reel history. Clark set her feet and let it fly from 31 feet. Nothing but net. Hardwood heroics. The shot capped by some measurements a 32-foot logo three, a shot courtside fans reacted to with pure disbelief in the moment. Total Pro Sports final score, Indiana 78, Washington 76. Clark herself described the sequence afterward with the kind of dry understatement that's become her trademark in big moments. Cody almost got a fingertip on it, she said. It kind of worked out perfectly that she went for the steal, and honestly probably the most wide-open shot I had all night, so my hands got a little clammy but still went in, I guess. Hardwood heroics. There's an important nuance buried in that quote, and in the broader reporting on the play. This wasn't a coaching staff deliberately benching its best player in crunch time out of some hidden agenda. It was a designed misdirection play that depends on a defender either taking the bait or not. McMahon gambled. She missed. Clark made the defense pay for it. That's not dysfunction, it's basketball working exactly the way these plays sometimes work, just not in the way it was diagrammed on the whiteboard. A season that made the moment land differently. Why did this particular sequence generate so much conversation when teams run decoy actions for their stars all the time? Context. Indiana came into the game at 5-5, having recently held a team meeting to address internal issues, and Clark herself had been working through a stretch of shooting struggles while also dealing with a tense, widely circulated sideline exchange with coach Stephanie White earlier in the season. Roundtable sports. None of that is invented texture. It's the backdrop that made a normal piece of late-game chaos feel, to a fan base that has spent 2 seasons watching every possession Clark touches, like it meant something larger. White was candid about that backdrop after the game. She acknowledged that the noise surrounding her star point guard wasn't likely to disappear just because of one shot, saying plainly that this is simply what Clark does. She makes big shots, and she has big moments. Roundtable sports. In a separate comment, White went further, crediting Clark directly rather than downplaying her role in the chaos. Sometimes we take great players and certainly generational talent for granted. What she did was incredible for us. I know she's going to have many more moments like that, and we needed this one tonight. Roundtable sports. That's not the language of a coach who designed her star out of the moment and got embarrassed by the result. It reads like a coach who's well aware of what she has in Clark, and is trying to balance that with a roster that includes other legitimate scoring options, Kelsey Mitchell, Lexi Hull, Aaliyah Boston, who also need touches and trust if Indiana wants to be more than a one-player team come playoff time. The Cunningham-Clark connection. If there's a real storyline buried in this game, it isn't institutional sabotage, it's chemistry. Clark and Sophie Cunningham have developed one of the more interesting on-court relationships in the league, the kind built across hundreds of shared possessions rather than drawn up in a single timeout. Cunningham finding Clark the instant the Mystics' coverage broke down wasn't luck stacked on luck. It was a guard who has played alongside Clark long enough to recognize, in real time, exactly where the seam in the defense would open up, and getting her the ball before the defense could recover. That instinctive trust is the more interesting basketball story here, more so than any suggestion of a fractured locker room. Teams that have been together long enough develop those reflexes, and Indiana's late-game execution, messy as it looked in the moment, produced exactly the outcome you'd want from a team with real cohesion. Someone reads the situation, makes the right read, and the most dangerous shooter on the floor ends up with the ball. What Washington was left with on the other side of the result, Washington's locker room had its own reckoning. Mystics head coach Sidney Johnson didn't dodge the central issue afterward, acknowledging directly that leaving a shooter of Clark's caliber wide open with a 1-point lead in the final seconds simply can't happen. Clutch Points asked what his rookie guard, who had abandoned her coverage to gamble for a steal, should take from the sequence. Johnson didn't sugarcoat it. It's hard to win in the W playing all the way through. I thought we learned a lot. I was incredibly proud of our fight. Clutch Points. It was Washington's second straight gut punch finish against Clark specifically. It marked the second time this season Clark had beaten the Mystics at the buzzer, having also hit a 3 with 1.7 seconds left to force overtime in an earlier meeting, though Washington won that game outright. Roundtable sports. For a young, rebuilding Mystics roster already absorbing a significant injury to forward Kiki Iriafen, the result stung in a very specific way. This was a game largely controlled by Washington for stretches, blown by one decision in the final seconds against the one player in the league you most want to avoid leaving open. The stat line and what came after for the record. Clark finished with 19 points, Kelsey Mitchell scored 15, and Aaliyah Boston added 14 in a milestone performance, becoming the 8th Fever player to reach 400 career assists, the first center in franchise history to do so, and recording her 43rd career double-double, second only to Tamika Catchings in franchise history. Roundtable sports. Indiana moved to 6-5 on the season with the win. A note on a claim that's circulated alongside this game in some commentary. The idea that Fever ticket sales for the next home game dropped to 0 in protest of the play design simply isn't supported by anything in the reporting around this game. If anything, the available coverage points the other way. Accounts of the Washington matchup describe a fully engaged, sold-out road environment in the moment of the shot, and there's no indication anywhere in mainstream WNBA coverage of any kind of ticket boycott following it. That detail appears to have originated from speculative commentary rather than anything verifiable, and it's worth being skeptical of it. The real takeaway: strip away the most dramatic framing, and what's left is a genuinely great basketball story. A team that nearly blew a 17-point lead. A young Mystics roster that fought back hard enough to make the result feel earned on both sides. A coverage breakdown that gave the league's most electric guard a clean look from 31 feet. And a finish that will end up on highlight reels for years. Clark's growing chemistry with Cunningham, the trust she's built with her coaching staff even through a rocky stretch, and her now well-established habit of producing signature moments in road environments where the building is actively rooting against her. That's the story. It doesn't need an invented conspiracy about sabotage or fan boycotts to be compelling. The shot itself, and the chaos that produced it, already is. The most striking thing about revisiting this game with a fuller record in hand is how often the real story turns out to be the opposite of the suspicious one. Two separate pieces of fever drama got attached to the Washington win in the days after, the team meeting and the Clark-White sideline exchange, and both, on inspection, undercut rather than support the idea that something was quietly wrong inside the organization. Start with the meeting. It happened, but not for the reason often implied. On May 30, the Fever were blown out by the Portland Fire, 184, in a game where Clark shot just 1 for 7, the second fewest field goal attempts of her WNBA career. And the team's defense was, in Stephanie White's words, disconnected from the opening minutes. The IX Sports, the Fever had jumped to an early 8-2 lead and then completely fell apart, trailing by 14 points after the first quarter alone, with two starters, Lexi Hull and Monique Billings, failing to make a single shot all night. The IX Sports, that loss is what triggered the players' only conversation, and the framing matters. It wasn't a confrontation about playmaking hierarchy or who gets the ball in crunch time. It was roughly 90 minutes of the team talking through defensive rotations and identity, a meeting the coaching staff initiated, but that became player-led as it went on. The IX Sports, Kelsey Mitchell put it plainly afterward. We needed that meeting. No one wants to have these meetings. But every team has them. The IX Sports, that's a team functioning the way healthy teams function under stress, not a locker room quietly cracking apart. The sideline moment from that same Portland game tells a similar story once you look past the freeze frame. Cameras caught White animated during a second quarter timeout, pointing toward Clark and slapping her knee, with Clark initially staying quiet before eventually responding with her own gestures. Yahoo Sports, the clip exploded online, racking up more than 400,000 views within 3 hours. Yahoo Sports. And for a few days it became the dominant storyline in Fever coverage, exactly the kind of moment that, taken in isolation and stripped of context, can be read as evidence of a fracture. But both people directly involved addressed it directly, and neither walked it back later. Clark told reporters 2 days afterward that the two of them are simply competitive people who want to win, and pushed back on outside speculation about what the moment meant. ESPN, White was even more direct about the nature of the exchange. I think what happened in that moment was I was challenging a player. It's coaching, it's what it is. I don't often think it becomes an issue if you're watching it in men's sports most of the time, and my relationship with Caitlin is great. I love Caitlin. I ride with her, we have a great relationship. Sports Illustrated, White went further, identifying exactly the dynamic that produces stories like the original transcript in the first place. I think the narrative of people trying to make it something that it's not is just taking sensationalism to try and get some clicks. Sports Illustrated, Clark's own language echoed that diagnosis almost word for word. I ride for Steph. I ride for these girls. Nobody with the Fever thought twice about it. It's just another example of what everybody, all of you, want to blow up and make something that it's just not in reality. Total Pro Sports, Cunningham closes the loop herself. If there's one piece of reporting that should settle the decoy controversy, question more or less permanently, it's this. Sophie Cunningham, the player who delivered the inbound pass that found Clark open, responded directly and publicly to the exact narrative the original transcript builds its entire case around. 2 days after the Washington win, Cunningham posted, "You guys read too much into things. That's the exact play our coach drew up, and we executed it perfectly." Athlon Sports, that single sentence collapses the central premise of the Fever sabotaged Clark storyline. It wasn't broken play improvisation that subverted a coaching decision. Clark's own teammates were embarrassed by Cunningham's own account. The called action and the result were the same thing. The decoy and misdirection design isn't an indictment of how Indiana uses its best player. It's a completely standard piece of late-game basketball that happened to work to perfection because a defender bit on the wrong read. It's worth sitting with why that distinction matters so much. The coach wouldn't even let her shoot. and the team had to go rogue to win story is dramatic. And it's the kind of framing that performs well as commentary because it taps into a real and ongoing public conversation about how much offensive control Clark should have on a team built around several legitimate scorers. But the team's actual play design used misdirection. The defense fell for it, and the result was the league's best shooter getting a wide-open look, is just a well-designed and well-executed basketball play. The emotional charge of the first version depends entirely on treating Cunningham's enthusiasm and Clark's grin as evidence of rebellion rather than what they more plausibly were. Two teammates celebrating a signature win together. Where the season went from there, the other piece worth adding is what happened after the Mystics game, because it reframes the entire moment as part of a turnaround rather than a crisis point. Indiana entered 2026 carrying real expectations after a 2025 campaign that saw them reach the playoffs and win a postseason round for the first time since 2015. Falling just 5 minutes of overtime short of a trip to the WNBA Finals despite injuries to Clark, Mitchell, and others down the stretch. The IX Sports, the front office responded that offseason by specifically targeting health and depth. General Manager Amber Cox emphasized expanded medical staff and resources, while White spoke about being deliberate with starters' minutes after a season in which Mitchell suffered rhabdomyolysis, an injury she herself attributed to overuse. The IX Sports, against that backdrop, the 4-4 start that preceded the Portland blowout, and the subsequent slide to 5-5 before the Mystics game, read less like dysfunction and more like a veteran team working through early-season turbulence with a roster still adjusting to new depth pieces. And the response validates that reading. Coverage in the days after the Mystics win described Clark, answering critics with some noise of her own, via the buzzer beater, framed explicitly as the Fever moving past the sideline spat with the help of the team meeting. Encyclopedia Britannica, days later, Indiana extended what became a genuine winning streak with a blowout win over the Toronto Tempo. Encyclopedia Britannica, by the most recent reporting available, Indiana sits at 9-7 on the season, WNBA. A meaningfully better record than the 6-5 mark they carried out of the Mystics' win, and one that suggests whatever functional friction existed in late may resolve the way functional friction on a good team typically does, through more wins. There have been bumps since Yahoo Sports team page notes Indiana dropping consecutive games to Angel Reese and the Atlanta Dream in more recent action, describing it as the latest chapter in what's been a turbulent stretch for the team. Yahoo Sports. But turbulence and trajectory are different things, and a team that went from 5-5 to 9-7 over this stretch isn't a team whose best player is being systematically sidelined by her own coaching staff. The pattern that actually explains the coverage, step back, and a more honest pattern emerges than the one the original commentary constructs. It isn't a story about an organization quietly working against its franchise player. It's a story about how much oxygen Caitlin Clark's every gesture, expression, and possession consumes in the current media environment, to the point that a standard piece of late-game basketball strategy, a normal coach-player sideline disagreement, and a defensive-minded team meeting all got independently reframed, by different commentators, into evidence of the same imagined crisis. That reframing has commercial incentives behind it. Clark is, by a wide margin, the most reliable subject in women's basketball for generating engagement, and content built around conflict, manufactured or real, tends to outperform content built around team wins ugly road game, players celebrate. The Portland sideline clip got 400,000 views in under 3 hours, specifically because it could be read as conflict. The Mystics' buzzer beater became a vehicle for a much bigger, much more dramatic story for the same reason. None of that makes the underlying basketball any less real or any less good. Clark's shot was a legitimately remarkable piece of clutch shooting, made under genuine pressure, off a genuinely well-designed misdirection play. It just means the conflict layered on top of it should be held to a higher standard of evidence than a meme, a shrug, and an unverifiable ticket sales statistic. What actually happened, stripped down to what's documented. Indiana blew a big lead, clawed through a chaotic final minute, ran a designed action that used Clark as a decoy exactly the way her own teammate later confirmed was intended, got the benefit of a defensive gamble that didn't pay off, and watched their best player make one of the more difficult shots in basketball to close it out. The coach praised her unreservedly afterward. Her teammate defended the integrity of the play call publicly, by name, against the very narrative now circulating. And the team kept winning in the weeks that followed. That's not a cautionary tale about a star being mismanaged. It's just what a good win on a good team, having a normal season, looks like from the inside, before the retelling adds the parts that were never there. The more interesting on-court relationships in the league, the kind built across hundreds of shared possessions rather than drawn up in a single timeout. Cunningham finding Clark the instant the Mystics' coverage broke down wasn't luck stacked on luck. It was a guard who has played alongside Clark long enough to recognize, in real time, exactly where the seam in the defense would open up, and getting her the ball before the defense could recover. That instinctive trust is the more interesting basketball story here, more so than any suggestion of a fractured locker room. Teams that have been together long enough develop those reflexes, and Indiana's late-game execution, messy as it looked in the moment, produced exactly the outcome you'd want from a team with real cohesion. Someone reads the situation, makes the right read, and the most dangerous shooter on the floor ends up with the ball. What Washington was left with on the other side of the result, Washington's locker room had its own reckoning. Mystics head coach Sidney Johnson didn't dodge the central issue afterward, acknowledging directly that leaving a shooter of Clark's caliber wide open with a 1-point lead in the final seconds simply can't happen. Clutch Points asked what his rookie guard, who had abandoned her coverage to gamble for a steal, should take from the sequence. Johnson didn't sugarcoat it. It's hard to win in the W playing all the way through. I thought we learned a lot. I was incredibly proud of our fight. Clutch Points, it was Washington's second straight gut punch finish against Clark specifically. It marked the second time this season Clark had beaten the Mystics at the buzzer, having also hit a 3 with 1.7 seconds left to force overtime in an earlier meeting, though Washington won that game outright. Roundtable Sports, for a young, rebuilding Mystics roster already absorbing a significant injury to forward Kiki Iriafen, the result stung in a very specific way. This was a game largely controlled by Washington for stretches, blown by one decision in the final